Hello, everyone. I am Jen Sato. I am a board member with HealthTechBuild. Welcome to our virtual event on connected devices today. We're excited that you're joining us. If this is the first HealthTechBuild event that you've been a part of, a bit about us. We are a mission-driven nonprofit with a goal to close the tech gap and accelerate digital technology in healthcare and life sciences. We've had a number of events in the Boston area and been fortunate and grateful to have some leading organizations participating in our events. And you can find out more information about that on our website, healthtechbuild.com. We've got a great lineup here today and would like to thank our speakers, Tyrone Higgins of BD, Greg Tracy of Propeller Health, Dana Fashina of Verily Life Sciences, Tom Busby of Outcome Capital, who will be moderating for us. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor, MediCuity. So without doubt, we're in a time of great change and uncertainty, and yet life science startup companies are raising capital at record rates. We've known for a while that digital tech brings great possibilities, but I think 6 months ago, it would have been difficult to imagine the rate of change that's possible. So great opportunities and challenges that come along with them, which we will talk about today. If you have questions during the webcast, please use the chat function and we will do our best to address them. Hope you enjoy the presentation and I will hand it over to Tom.
Great, thank you so much, Jen, and appreciate everyone taking some time out to learn about this exciting sector and some of the dynamics that we're starting to see. It's my pleasure to be able to moderate this event on behalf of Outcome Capital, being a digital health and technology and life science investment banking group. You know, we've seen a lot of action in this space, and it was actually just last year around this time that with HealthTechBuild, we were celebrating Livongo's IPO in July. You know, it's been amazing to see that in just this short amount of time, Livongo has 4x'd their valuation since their IPO pricing and are now merging with Teladoc. Just yesterday, we had Amwell filing to go public and also announcing a $100 million equity investment from Google. So certainly, you know, it's really without question that the digital health sector is really pivoting from being poised to taking off with digital therapeutics and connected devices to now really truly becoming a standard of care. And it's with this in mind that we thought that this event would really be pertinent, especially with the tailwinds of COVID helping to accelerate some of these technologies in the hands of patients and also providers. We're excited to have with us 3 expert panelists from the digital health community, spanning the engineering, cybersecurity, quality assessment, and strategic frameworks here. We have with us Dana Fashina from Verily Life Sciences, software quality engineer, Tyrone Higgins from Becton Dickinson BD, regional product security officer for the North America geography, and Greg Tracy from Propeller Health, which, if you recall, was one of the first digital therapeutics acquisitions. They were acquired by ResMed about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And Greg is the chief technology officer and co-founder at Propeller Health. Excited to have all of you with us today. For today's event, we have a few questions that are going to be geared towards and targeted to a few of our specific panelists. And then we're going to open it up a little bit more to a little bit of a wholesome discussion. So with that, if we could have our panelists just take a minute and introduce themselves, give a little bit of color on their background and what they oversee at their respective firms. Dana, could we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Dana Fashina. I am the software quality lead for Verily Life Sciences. And as you probably saw in the bio, my background is in medical device engineering with deep expertise in software as a medical device and digital therapeutics. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
Great. Thanks, Dana. Tyrone? Tyrone, I think you're on mute, actually, if we can take you off.
The phrase of the year. I think you're on mute. Hello, everyone. Good morning or afternoon. Tyrone Higgins from BD, Regional Product Security Officer. As the Regional Product Security Officer, I am responsible for all things cybersecurity in the North America region. My primary focus is on relationship building within the community, law enforcement, regulators, and internally, I try to ensure that our framework is adopted and applied by all of our business units and functions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tyrone. And Greg, could you take a minute?
Sure. So my name is Greg Tracy. I'm one of the co-founders and chief technology officer at Propeller Health. We build digital therapeutics for respiratory disease, trying to help patients experience their disease differently through a combination of hardware and software. I'm responsible for product and engineering and data and infrastructure inside of Propeller. As of about 6 months ago, I took on some additional duties. I'm also chief architect across the enterprise for ResMed. Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Greg. And actually, Greg, our first question is for you. So given that the COVID-19 pandemic really has at best complicated patient visits to their physicians and being able to interact with their physicians, and really at worst has kept patients from seeing their providers altogether, how have you seen digital technologies sort of filling the gaps that COVID may have caused in a patient's treatment plan? And I guess particularly to Propeller Health, especially within chronically ill patient populations, how have you seen digital technologies hold up?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there's so much in society that has hit pause with the pandemic. Chronic disease management is definitely not one of them. So most patients with chronic disease, whether it be respiratory or diabetes or something else, they're managing that disease week over week and sometimes day over day. So I think COVID certainly hasn't allowed for those folks managing diseases any sort of a break. However, I think that this is like a moment for digital in many ways, right? The great superpower, I think, of digital is enabling patients to take a little bit more control over their disease. So whether or not they're in a clinic and visiting a physician, I think digital unlocks the capability for them to have a little bit more of a transparent relationship with their disease, start to discover new things about their disease they were unaware of. And in those episodes where they are interacting with their providers, it's a data-driven conversation. So in so many ways, I think that COVID has been a moment here, I think, in time for digital to really demonstrate its value. And most of us that are selling services in digital here do it in all sorts of different ways. You've got, I think, the Omada and Livongos of the world do a really nice job with behavior change and coaching. The Sanvellos of the world, I think, on mental health, they're a little more episodic. They're there when patients need it. And in our case, we take a more passive approach. So we tend to sit in the back and work on patients' behalf to try to help them discover new things about their disease, help them understand what their triggers may be. And then looking forward, give them a little bit more of a heads up as to whether or not this could be a challenging day for them. And all the while trying to build a sort of a stronger relationship back with their physician and make those encounters a data-driven conversation.
So it sounds like, Greg, that there's really this organic demand from the patient side to really take a little bit more of a hand in their own care treatment plans and understanding, what that's going to look like. What's been your experience in terms of demand? Is it really more on the patient side? Or have you also seen providers saying, no, I want to be able to empower my patients with these technologies? What's your experience been there?
I think broadly in digital, we're still very much at the starting line. So I still think that organizations that we sell through, whether it's a health system, a payer, a pharmacy benefit manager, it's a push model. So they're trying to deliver new tools and services out to their members. And so it's a little bit of a push. That's going to change. I think there are some giant consumer brands here that are causing individuals and consumers to think differently about their healthcare management. And I think nobody does it better probably than Apple, who, if you look at the work they've done with HealthKit, the work they've done on the watch, they've made, I think, healthcare a little bit more consumer friendly and accessible. And those sorts of trends will, I think, ultimately drive more of a pull model where patients are going to start expecting to have access to services like that when they sign up for a health plan or when they go visit their healthcare provider. They're going to start, I think, demanding it, but we're not there yet. I don't think. I think we're still very much at the starting line.
And if I could actually just push you on that for one quick second, I know that my experience is probably not limited just to me, but when I go to see my provider and I've done work on WMD and WebMD to find out, what could I have and what could the results be, not all providers are excited that some of those patients have done some of that homework. Specifically with Propeller Health and your patient subset, have you been able to create stronger relationships, do you think, between the patients and the providers at that point?
Definitely. I mean, I think in the case of respiratory, there is a struggle, I think, between patients and physicians, because the treatment plan that a patient may get may require them to take a medication every day. And so if you're seeing your physician every 6 months, and the first question is, well, how compliant have you been on your meds? And I say, I'm great. I've been taking it once a day or twice a day. I'm 75% adherent. There is oftentimes a sense of doubt, because maybe that patient had an ER visit while they were in between visits.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're actually in the clinic because they exacerbated. And so there's a little bit of a confrontational aspect, I think, to that, of like, do I actually believe my patient and the words they're saying? And I think digital just completely changes that conversation. And instead of that Q&A phase and trying to build trust between the two parties,
mm-hmm.
you're actually just operating off of data. Like, I can see objectively that I'm 75% adherent and I'm still not responding well to that therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So my therapy may actually need to change as a result. So I think just changing that conversation, so it's an objective conversation, has huge benefits for both the folks providing care as well as the individual patients managing their chronic disease.
Great. I think, part of this as well, part of digital health's takeoff has also been the FDA being a little bit more forward-looking, arguably, in terms of trying to adopt some of these technologies. Dana, I was interested actually in understanding as well, and for the HealthTechBuild community, part of digital health's takeoff is really due to, and again, limited by actually the FDA. What's really been your experience in dealing with the FDA? Have they shown openness to adopting these technologies? Do you find them to be a little bit reticent? Are there specific areas where they seem to be most interested, or are there other areas where they really seem to shy away from being excited?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think right now, FDA has shown deep interest in a lot of technical solutions around technologies that promote virtual care. And so, as I'm sure many of our audience is familiar with, FDA released a number of EUAs, emergency use authorizations. These are basically guidance documents that allow organizations to fast track their development process, specifically for diagnostic, non-diagnostic, and digital therapeutics. So I think they're seeing, to Greg's point, a huge need for it right now in this pandemic. And so it's a really, really good time for medical device manufacturers, but particularly software medical device manufacturers.
And I guess, have you seen COVID compel the FDA to focus on certain technologies that might help get us through this pandemic? Or are these still sort of dormant interests that have really been pulled right through, and the pandemic has only made them more obvious?
I think it's a bit of both. I think the pandemic sped up the FDA's interest in these technologies and probably broadened their awareness of the different applications of these technologies. I think regulators are still catching up to more advanced technologies like AI and machine learning, but for sure developing solutions that can serve in place of remote healthcare, which is helpful for both the patient, but also for the HCP, right? I think that's something that we're still trying to figure out, how to keep our doctors and our healthcare staff safe. And so right now, if there are other technologies that can help enable this, FDA is really paying attention to those and has granted a lot of, you could say, fast track provisions. We know that once the pandemic is over, those guidances require us to go back and, let's say, complete our design controls documentation. But for now, I find that a lot of good times are here because FDA can show us how to use our existing capabilities better and how we can apply it right now for the COVID pandemic.
And have you seen any sort of a difference in terms of how the FDA approaches, let's say, software-based assets or app-based assets, as opposed to connected devices or medical devices on that side? Or do you see it being pretty similar between the two spaces?
It's a bit of both. I think that FDA has a lot of leniency towards devices, connected devices that are strictly based on monitoring and adherence. Those are typically low risk, sometimes enforcement discretion devices, and FDA is like more than willing to kind of let organizations take that to market on themselves. I think for connected devices, with its integrated software connecting to hardware systems, they still apply the same rigor that they have been applying. I think it's probably a little bit more ownership on the manufacturer to still bring their design documentation up to snuff, knowing that FDA can't pop in there and surprise them. But they seem to be willing to allow manufacturers of digital therapeutics, so mental health, sleep apnea, can't sleep, or adherence to existing drug profiles that their doctors have already put them on pre-pandemic. They seem to be much more willing to allow those technologies to go through faster. And they want to boost and promote that as well.
And Dana, I know that in the HealthTechBuild audience and community, we have a number of entrepreneurs who are excited about working with I don't know if excited is the right word, but they're looking forward to working with the FDA to get their assets, regulated and approved. If you were to sit down with some digital health entrepreneurs who are getting ready for that process, any guidance or tips or suggestions that you'd want to impart to them?
Assuming these developers are software as medical device or digital therapeutic developers or investors?
Yep. Let's say software as a medical device, yeah.
Yeah, I think if you can find a niche, basically an unmet need, right now COVID is a great forum, it's a great open space to find these unmet needs for digital therapeutics. And if you can demonstrate the application of that, which again in COVID should be pretty well focused, FDA is more than willing to have the conversations on how you can bring that product to market. A good benefit to these manufacturers would be that you wouldn't need to necessarily submit a de novo device classification because there's so many existing devices that already exist for your 510K submission. Another benefit to new investors or new manufacturers is depending on the type of device you create, it could be considered very low risk or even enforcement discretion. And that gives you a lot more leeway without even having to go in front of FDA. So if you can define the components of your medical device and demonstrate that, it could be something as simple as a survey, taking questions, and then making a decision for whether the patient should seek further help. A huge benefit, right, without having to go to the doctor. And that wouldn't be a product that would necessarily need to go through 510K submission. And so if manufacturers are looking for an application of existing technologies, for sure I would recommend try to find something that can serve an immediate need, and then look through the risk classification for that product. And there's existing other devices that we can consider to use as a classification for this device. And FDA is more than willing to have conversations with organizations about that.
Great.
Hey, Tom, I'd like to add on to that actually, because I've done this a couple times now where I built and sold software as a medical device. And I would encourage everybody that's starting to start from a point of assuming there's going to be a 510K and build a quality management system that they do all their development under. I have seen others take the route of build, and then they get to the filing point and they have to sort of bolt on a process or a chunk of documentation, and they usually don't fare so well. So if you're operating sort of from the beginning in your development process under a QMS, the results tend to be much, much better. But if you get to the point of deciding to do a 510K, the filings themselves are less burdensome.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's for sure. My initial assumption was that they would have a QMS in their organization. That is primary. Yes.
So if Greg and Dana, if I'm hearing you correctly, I guess part of the guidance to entrepreneurs in the space would be thinking about the FDA and the regulatory process early on in your strategy. Don't wait to finish development before you start to cross that hurdle, but make those considerations far earlier in your process. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. And then to Greg's point, stand up your organization for that FDA visit, right? For that encounter. Mm-hmm. So standing up your organization means establishing a QMS, having procedures. I think the biggest challenge for SAMD or digital therapeutic manufacturers comes when you're trying to use or creating your product that uses external third-party libraries, which is huge. Even in Verily, we do that. Mm-hmm. And so those third-party libraries, also known as SOUP, FDA has created new guidances for how manufacturers should document that SOUP. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that you wouldn't know if you didn't stand up your organization under a QMS. And so it's really, it pays itself forward if you get those dots crossed, or those dots, those I's dotted and those T's crossed. It really pays itself forward.
It can really be a value builder as well for a company. And if we can actually just push here just for actually one more second too.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've had a lot of companies, you know, developmental stage companies come and ask, you know, do I need to have a full-time regulatory person on staff, or is this something that I should plan to outsource entirely? What would be your feelings there in terms of kind of how to overcome that and address it?
I would say think long-term, right? Think long-term. What is the overall objective of your organization? What type of products do you want to create? You could have a consultant rather than a full-time person if you just needed them, let's say, for a one-time instant. But knowing that, you know, once you do have your product listed, FDA could come in and audit you, virtual or otherwise. It might be helpful to have some of that knowledge in-house. My preference and recommendation probably would not be to outsource your regulatory or even your quality group, but to have some level of knowledge in-house and then seek external support as needed.
Mm-hmm. Again, don't make it an afterthought to your strategy. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've seen that by so many organizations, myself included, right? Not at Verily, but in other past lives, I've seen that bite us in the butt a lot of times.
Great.
One of the first people that the first person that Propeller hired outside of the founding team was a quality and regulatory officer. So yeah, and I think it actually, on young companies, it sets a tone in the culture that it matters. So it's not actually not just the work itself, but there's I think a cultural benefit there that gets demonstrated to everybody that comes on afterwards, that this is important to the business.
Mm-hmm. And have you ever seen, and Tyrone, feel free to jump in here as well, and we do have a question for you next actually, but this has really been a topic of interest for a lot of entrepreneurs. When it comes to the regulatory side as well, you know, we've noticed at times that you see a company, a digital health company, that gets split between the technologists and the engineers and the life scientists on the other end, who are more familiar, perhaps, let's say, with doing clinical trials. Do you ever notice culturally some challenges or difficulties in the digital health space because of that? On one side, you have technologists saying, let's move fast and break things. And on the other side, you have, you know, trained PhD life scientists who are saying, we need to run controlled trials to get the data that we need to get through the FDA. I'll stop there, but any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So risk management, right? When you talk about enterprise risk management, when you talk about product safety, from a technologist perspective, the type of risks that get prioritized are different than that of someone with a medical background. And what underscores everything we do in medtech and in healthcare is patient safety. And so those technical folks may not be as well-versed or knowledgeable on the kinds of risks that may result in patient safety hazards. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I second that. I think it's not uncommon for young development houses and even existing large global organizations to want to move fast enough. And so we pull in the best developers. And because you're coming into a regulated industry, a lot of the developers, a lot of that expertise is towards the commercial space. And so it really is quite a growth curve to educate them about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how it impacts that clinical side. And oftentimes these two teams don't talk. And so what I find it more effective is pulling the clinical team in early, especially as you're doing your product conception, early feasibility, you're trying to narrow out what that design would look like. Really helpful when you're trying to establish the risk classification of your product. To Tyrone's point, patient harm is really how you will know how much design documentation you'll need to have in place, is whether your product can introduce significant patient harm. And so most developers wouldn't have that early site information, even if they did have quality and regulatory support. It's really helpful to have those teams aligned up front before, let's say, they split their separate ways. And so if you're small enough to do it, I definitely think that's a great idea to do.
And earlier you mentioned a substantial investment, right, from Google in this space. And that's always one of the things that I have in the back of my mind is the implications of safety and the dynamic difference between a traditional IT space in healthcare, right? The healthcare companies like Becton Dickinson, we have a long history and tradition of doing this the correct way. And my fear sometimes is that new players will come into this space without having a full appreciation for those, I guess, safeguards that have been put in place. And when you start talking about things like software development and the buzzwords like everything's agile, everything's fast, right? But safety sometimes isn't a fast thing, right?
And Tyrone, actually, that's a great segue into our next question. You know, just as with other industries becoming more digital forward and digital oriented, you know, when we look at financial services, I think we were talking just before this, I can't remember the last time I was in a bank. You know, everything from deposits to moving money, it's all done on a phone or online. You know, traditional commerce is really being displaced with e-commerce. And media, of course, you know, the rise of social media is starting to displace otherwise traditional media outlets. And with all of these advancements, you know, there's been a concern for data privacy, data security. You know, we see that recently with Twitter hacks, with financial services hacks, but in the healthcare sector, and Dana, you brought this up, you know, there's some real life and death risks here to be aware of, whether we're talking about in-hospital equipment or for instance, implanted pacemakers. You know, there's a real concern about associated risks and the security. So, you know, Tyrone, if you were to give an opinion on how ready is the industry to go digital and how safe do we feel our data is, you know, where would you place us?
Right. So just before I answer that, I just want to give a little bit of context to set the stage, right? So cybersecurity in the healthcare space is a very nascent concept. When you look at the regulatory body of work, right? The first time that the FDA formally made any requirements for cybersecurity was in 2014 with the 2014 pre-market guidance, right? There's since been updates and there's been a release of a draft of a new pre-market guidance. And then earlier this year, you had the International Medical Device Regulators Forum release principles and practices for medical device security. So it's the first of its kind as well. So here we are in 2020, and we have the first international best practice document for cybersecurity. So with cybersecurity being such a new topic, we don't have the same long-standing history of doing it right that I just spoke about with cybersecurity, and there are risks that can result in significant patient harm, and that's one of the primary safeguards that the FDA tries to guard against. But when you ask, are we ready? On Mother's Day, May 2017, we found out globally that we were not ready, right? There was a ransomware malware called WannaCry that completely decimated the European healthcare system. And the reason why this occurred is because a lot of the medical devices leveraged a Windows operating system that had been out of support for some time. And when software is out of support, right, it becomes vulnerable and susceptible to cyber attacks. And we learned the hard way that in our field, cybersecurity is very important. Right. But there's a lot of things that the industry and the FDA are doing to address this concern, right? So now you have the standing up of a bunch of different cybersecurity working groups. There's the Health Sector Coordinating Council that's led by CISA, which is under the Department of Homeland Security. There's the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. I actually was a facilitator for a threat modeling bootcamp last week with the FDA, MDIC, and the MITRE company. The FDA earlier this year, before COVID, was working on establishing what they call a CIMSAB, a Cyber Medical Expert Analysis Board, right? A go team, a boots on the ground team for when cyber events happen, the team that they action. And it is a community of practice, right? It's not all on the FDA. It's not all on the device manufacturer. It's not all on law enforcement. It's together, right? We're only as strong as our weakest link. So if my company manufactures secure products and you put it on your network that's insecure, I'm still susceptible to the same risk. Or if someone else manufactures insecure products and the network is secure, but that device introduces risk to the network, all the other devices in the healthcare delivery organization's environment are susceptible. So it's truly a community of practice. And the approach that the FDA has taken is in creating a community of practice. You'll see the FDA at things like DEF CON and Black Hat, which are hacker conferences. You'll see the FDA engage with companies like I Am the Cavalry, which is a security researcher community. And you'll see them lean on companies like BD for help on architecting what best practice for secure product development looks like in a manufacturer. We were a part of a program that developed what's called the Joint Security Plan in conjunction with the Health Sector Coordinating Council. And essentially what that is how to develop safe products, how to do product security. It's a voluntary document that has the industry collaboration and a stamp of approval from the HSCC, which is under DHS. But yeah, so were we ready? No. Are we ready? I'm never going to take the stance and say that we're ready, but we're doing better and things are absolutely getting better.
Great. So, one of the things that I think that we can hear is there seems to be some collaboration on behalf of strategics to work together and address cybersecurity. You used the word community, which I think is a great word.
Right.
So I guess, two follow-up questions. One, is that true? Do you see some collaboration among strategics to sort of address this?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. You were going to ask this.
And then I was actually going to say, from a strategic perspective, if you were to, to think of this from a resource allocation perspective, right? So BD has numerous large instruments that are already in market. Does it make more sense to try to modernize some of those systems or to create whole new systems and technologies and deploy those and try to get those adopted?
Sure. So the approach that we've taken, and this is what you're talking about is legacy devices, right? And that's also a topic that's near and dear to the FDA's heart right now, and a topic that's very being prioritized in our industry. And actually, the document that I talked about from the IMDRF, it has a conceptual framework for how we should handle medical devices, legacy medical devices. But the approach that we've taken historically at BD is if something's already in the market and we have products that predate our product security program, we still do a risk assessment and then we communicate the risk to the customers in the form of a white paper. And then we create design requirements and we use a go forward strategy. So we try to ensure that we're doing security and building security into our products going forward. But for the items that predate our program, they at a minimum get a risk assessment and a white paper. And the reason why we do that is because you can't protect what you don't know. So we make them aware of the gaps that we see as the experts on the product to give them the opportunity to either address them on that device or update to the latest device.
Great. I want to remind everyone tuning in today that if you have any questions, please do feel free to submit them in the chat. And to that end, we actually have our first question from the chat coming from Mary Beth Schonering, the founder of Ramp Up Health. And this is for all three panelists. What obstacles for the deployment of innovative solutions vis-a-vis distribution channels to facilitate market adoption? What can be done to overcome, some of the adoption barriers for digital health technologies?
I can jump in on that. So a couple of things I've seen done. If the digital therapeutic, let's say, is not a regulatory class 2 or class 3 device, which most of them are not, they're either class 2 or class 1 ED, it's not uncommon to try and put your product in a clinical trial. And that's quite common and it's not terribly difficult to do. It's a great way to get a feel for what your product would look like in the market. Another avenue could be doing a value stream mapping, which is basically where you think about how your tool could stack up in the value suite of other products being offered to patients in a clinical or insurance environment. So that means see if you can work or partner with insurance companies to find value in your product, and perhaps they can adopt your product as a manner of lowering insurance or as part of that insurance selection. I think one of the best ways that I've seen, at least in my expertise of how newer technologies are adopted, especially from smaller organizations, is to partner up with a larger organization. So show value, demonstrate value. If you aren't able to do a clinical trial, or if you aren't able to do a small sample pilot, partnerships are a great way to elevate your brand, but also to have that brand integrated with a global or somebody that's more well noted to see and to apply use of your product.
Great. Thank you, Dana.
I think this is the $64,000 question. Really, it's I don't know that anybody in digital health is going to claim that they've solved the distribution problem necessarily. I agree with Dana that it's really important that you build evidence and show efficacy of the solution. Like that, I think should be table stakes now. But actually getting it into somebody's hands is still a hard problem. And I would argue that like it's not so much like the healthcare system is struggling here. It's the delivery part that is struggling, because there's no mechanism today for distribution of digital, right? So you think today, if you're getting prescribed a medication, there's a whole like ecosystem and like chain of players that fill that need. You can go to the corner drugstore and you can fill your prescription and pick it up. You can get it from Amazon now. Like there's a huge piece of infrastructure that's in place for distribution of medication. That doesn't exist in digital. It's one of the hardest problems, I would say, for all digital health companies. It's no different for us. And as Dana pointed out, one way to get around this is to partner. So we do distribution in a variety of ways. I would say on the scale side, the best way we've been able to find success is through partnership with Pharma. So we're aligned with really all of the big respiratory pharma companies. And there's shared incentives there for us to go enroll a large number of patients. And they have very large marketing budgets as well, much more than a smaller company does. So this is a hard problem though. And it's not, sorry, I've already forgotten your name, who had asked that question, but this isn't, this is your new reality, actually. You can build a product that's really great and effective, but that's not the hardest problem you have to solve. And we didn't realize that when we started.
We're getting a few questions in as well on how to pick an indication, specifically for digital therapeutics. And Greg, I think this one points to you a little bit. How did you land on COPD? And for entrepreneurs trying to get into digital therapeutics, what indications would you suggest them looking at and why?
Well, for us, I mean, my co-founder and our CEO, David Van Sickle's an asthma epidemiologist. So he's been studying asthma his whole career. And worked for the CDC for a long time and was trying to understand the root cause of many outbreaks. And he's the one that actually came up with the original idea of, well, why don't we just put a radio on top of all of these medications and use that as a proxy to understand when individuals and at large, when communities are worsening. So it's really, respiratory is very much in our DNA. And that's how we landed in it. I think if you look today at applying digital, there aren't many areas probably that don't already have some number of players in it. I'm going to stop short of making a recommendation of what somebody may go after. We're very, very focused on respiratory, and that's what we live and breathe every day.
Great.
Yeah, it's also helpful too. Sorry, just to jump in there. It's also helpful too if you can find an unmet need within an existing niche. And so to Greg's point about partnering with pharma, my background, I'm coming from Sanofi, right? And we are a drug company, and a lot of how to get that drug out is what pharma companies would love to know, right? And they would want to partner with people that can help promote that drug. And so a niche, for example, in pharma could be, we're trying to understand patients with metastatic prostate cancer. But the niche is not just the patients that have it, it's that group between, let's say, 50 and 65 who don't go to the doctor because of it, because there's a stigma, because maybe they're afraid of technology, because they might think they're too old to go and go through chemo, when actually chemo could be a much later alternative. So the niche could be just a specific population within an existing disease management group. that you can focus the application of your technology for. And those are the areas that I think pharma companies would be much happier to partner with, because that would increase and boost their drug, of course, without any of the existing channels that they've gone through. And so looking for those kind of unmet needs are really a great way to kind of make your product stand out, because to Greg's point, the market is really getting saturated with a lot of digital therapeutics. So it's becoming a little harder to stand out.
And so the three of you have actually brought up one word: partnerships, for young companies to think about. When in a company's development, would you suggest that they go and initiate some of that strategic dialogue and start to talk to market players about trying to collaborate? When should an entrepreneur be thinking about that?
I think immediately. It's never too soon to build relationships. And you don't have to establish a relationship with a specific goal in mind. It can just be the cross collaboration. So in my field, we don't compete on security. Like, we believe security is an assumption all patients should be able to make. Safety is an assumption you should be able to make. So we collaborate all of the time, be it through the proper channels like ISALs or the established organizations. But relationships, you can't improve in a bubble. So if you're a new company, those relationships, I feel like, will expedite your time to having a tangible product.
Yeah, to further that too, once you've found a niche or that unmet need, that's a great time to start partnering, right? And shop that your solution to multiple partners, because you want them to be a part, and they want to be a part of developing and growing that solution with you. And so a lot of that early market knowledge, that early market sharing will be because of that partnership. A lot of learnings you'll have will be because of that partnership. And so if you can get them onboarded or at least interested earlier on, you'll have a lot more information, a lot more data to make your solution much stronger.
Great.
I agree with that. And those partnerships will make you aware of things that could be potential pitfalls later on down the line. So for me, I'm thinking about regulations like EU MDR or the GDPR, and the rules are different depending on where you want to distribute your device. And so if you create a device where all of the information is stored on the device, but the geographical region where you want to sell the device disallows that, partnering with people in the industry could make you aware of that. And that's a very generalized, simple example, but those types of pitfalls, things that could be pitfalls later, you can be made aware of earlier.
We had a question come in from Jeffrey Mantis. How quickly will devices move from Wi-Fi and Bluetooth to 5G and direct cellular, in your opinion?
So I'll take the first stab at that. So in the healthcare space, we are millenniums behind the other vectors like finance and even defense, right? And so when you talk about the technologies that medical devices leverage, like Bluetooth is fairly new, Wi-Fi is still fairly new. When you talk about Wi-Fi protocols, the most common Wi-Fi protocol now is like WPA2, and we're going to be on that for a while for the same reason that WannaCry happened, right? Medical devices don't necessarily lose their usability because they're end of life or a manufacturer wants to end of life it. And there are a lot of third world countries or other situations where even though there's elevated risk for this end of life product, there's still usability, and they would rather use that product with the risk than not have it at all. And so when you talk about technologies like that, because of the environment and the natural state of healthcare, legacy technologies will have a longer life than in most other technology realms. Right? This isn't a fringe technology where we're always hopping to the latest and greatest. It's more like we're using this to keep people alive. So if it works, don't mess with it.
Yeah, I think so much depends on the business models here. In the consumer space for individuals, it's a little bit harder. I mean, cellular is still relatively expensive. and form factor and power issues play a big role, because you don't, ideally, especially for somebody with chronic disease, they're burdened every day by the disease. So you can't put a piece of technology in their life that is an additional burden, right? So if it's cellular and they've got to charge it once a week, it's like another task, another reminder that they have asthma. So I think that's from a user experience standpoint, it's still a little bit tricky for consumers to pull that off. Mm-hmm. And on a more like aggregate level, I don't know yet that somebody's found the business model to really make that scale.
Mm-hmm. Dana, anything to add, or can we go on to the next one?
I think the guys covered it.
Oh, great. So we did have a question come in from Mark Snyder as well. How have HDOs and MDMs prioritized security? And this is for everyone. So we're looking at health delivery organizations and also medical decision-making frameworks. How is security coming into play in terms of adoption?
So I think that is the $64,000 question. So to be on in all transparency, and I say we because it's a community of practice, we still have difficulty getting organizations to adequately prioritize security. If things aren't broken, why fix it? And then also security is often looked at as a secondary feature. And oftentimes it takes some vision, some forethought to be able to look down the road at the risk of tomorrow and to plan for them today. And so when you have people dealing with life or death situations and you can't make that tie-in to how this may impact that, it makes it difficult to get funding, to get resources, and to properly prioritize it until something happens. Like I made the joke when we were talking that before WannaCry happened, we had difficulty prioritizing because it had never happened. And they're like, it's never happened. Why would I allocate resources for it? And then after it happened, and it's been a couple of years now, it's like, well, that was only one time, right? And so it's like, how many times does it need to happen to be important? Or what's the environment? What does the environment need to look like in order for it to be prioritized?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would agree, even in product development efforts, the first level of security we often think of is patient security or patient safety. We don't really think about device security, cybersecurity threats, and that seems to be an afterthought. And one of the things I've been trying to drive within my teams is the cybersecurity risk, your security risk management profile should feed into your product risk management profile. It's not independent, and it's not an afterthought. Because to Tyrone's point, you could have a completely safe device being used on a fragile network or vice versa. And you've completely still disbanded your product, right, from being able to function as intended, or it increases its risk of adverse event reporting. And so part of that is just, particularly for the medical decision makers, is bringing that level of knowledge earlier as part of the planning. I think a limitation we've had was that the security guidances, security standards are just surfacing. And by just, I mean in the 2014 to now time period, which is really, really young, right? A lot of the older guidances, a lot of the older standards go all the way back to 94. And so we have, I think part of the challenge too is getting regulators to keep up the pace with development. I think if regulators can keep up the pace, manufacturers would have a better idea of what the expectations were, when to apply the expectations, and they can start building that culture inherently. Right now, it's a little bit of an afterthought. It's sort of modeling where the industry regulators are now, but we could do a much better job as a community pulling that knowledge in now, knowing what we want to do in the future.
All right. So Dana, I want to add on to that. And so I agree that some of the onus is on regulators, but I also feel like some of the onus is on us as device manufacturers. And often we build to the regulatory requirement. And I feel like it shouldn't, like if you can do more, then do more, right? You shouldn't be trying to do the least common denominator, right? So what's the minimum that I need to do to get this to market, right? You should be doing what a responsible manufacturer should be doing, whether or not there's a regulatory precedent. Then secondarily, when you said that cyber risk should feed into your overarching risk management process, that's absolutely correct. And there is a new guidance document, as you said, TIR 57, that talks about how to do that for anyone who's interested. In the pre-market, TIR 57 is pre-market, and then TIR 97 for the post-market.
Mm-hmm.
One of the tough things about security is, and this is an unfortunate thing, is you can't sell security, actually. Like if you think of the pitch deck when you're pitching a healthcare system, you have your SOC 2 logo on there, you've got your ISO cert logo on there, but there's never a pause in the room for a discussion about security. Right? It's really not something that sells. So to Tyrone's point of, do I do the minimum or do I go the full distance? That's a cultural thing actually inside the company, or it's something that comes out in contracting because the IT team at your payer or your health system or your partner sticks the screws to your system. But the fact that it's not a sellable thing actually, I think, is one of the aspects that works against us, I would say broadly.
So to your great point, we do have customers beginning to ask for information security agreements that have indemnification implications, right? So they want it to be contracted into their service agreement that if you don't provide X level of service, then we get to forego X dollar amount of payment, right?
Yeah. That certainly curbs behavior.
So I think we have time for one more question. You know, one of the topics and issues that seems to be coming a lot in digital health and connected health community is as it relates to COVID-19. And we've seen this real interest and drive towards connected health and people, you know, for the first time doing telehealth visits that never had, people doing physical therapy visits virtually that they never thought that they would do. You know, I know that I've had family members who've heard of telehealth for a long time. Their healthcare payers paid for it, but they had never done it, and now they are. Do we view, or should we view COVID-19 as a real turning point in digital health, that we're kind of starting to move into the next chapter and phase and normalize digital health? Or is some of this a little bit of an aberration? And as we start to get past COVID-19, are people going to forget about some of those experiences they had?
I am hopeful that it sticks. I struggle a bit, I think, when telehealth gets lumped in broadly with digital therapeutics at large, because video is ubiquitous, right? I mean, we're doing video. When you call your friends, you use FaceTime, right? So video is part of our life, and I think we have turned to it in the pandemic as a convenience. Mm-hmm. But I have bigger ambitions for digital. I want digital to really change health outcomes. Video won't change health outcomes, right? It reduces the friction of some care delivery, but I don't think it actually changes health outcomes. So I hope all of us have, beyond when the pandemic ends, we stick to our ambitions for what digital can provide for patients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So
I
I'll
would second that.
I'll just add that. No, go ahead, Dana. I'm sorry. Lady first.
Okay, sorry, I would just add to that, Greg. I agree. I had my first telehealth visit with my doctor last week, and it was awesome. I needed to refill a prescription, didn't have to go in, didn't have to park, like a number of burdens are just removed by telehealth, and it was about 10 minutes. I think a lot of people that are non-serious or non-threateningly ill will find a lot of value post-COVID in this digital telehealth environment that we live in. I think there's a lot of value in it. I think a good portion of digital therapeutics right now that are doing monitor and adherence rely on some form of telehealth, whether it's through video or through its back-end monitoring system, to still be able to be aware of where the patient is and provide direction or prescription to them. I think if we tag on a video to an existing platform and to an existing device, you've really expanded the use of it in a really helpful way. So to Greg's point, I'm hopeful we keep it up. I think the value of it has presented itself very clearly. I think doctors on their own end, just talking with my doctor, she was happy to be home. She was happy to keep her family safe and non-exposed as well. And so I think if there's specialists or people that we can't get to as conveniently, I think telehealth importance will begin to rise. And I hope that it stays as well.
So I'll just say that telehealth was burgeoning before COVID. And if you ever needed a sales pitch, like we just got the biggest one that you could ever have for the potential use cases for telehealth. And because of the impact of COVID, I think that it's here to stay as a tangible risk for the foreseeable future.
Fantastic. I think that if it's okay with everyone, there's one topic that is starting to come up now too, and I just wanted to touch on it briefly. Greg, Dana, I think you had also suggested this too, and it's something that we've talked about as well. It seems to be the case that consumer health and healthcare that's deployed from a provider, clinical health, seem to be sort of coming into one a little bit more. And so you've got Fitbits and Apple Watches on one side. Greg, we have devices like Propeller Health's devices coming in on the other side on clinical health. Is this confluence of sort of consumer and clinical health coming together helpful for digital health? Or does it actually hurt sometimes some of the value props that true digital health companies have to offer?
Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what Google does with Fitbit. I think Fitbit tried to pivot into more of like a digital health type of a solution, but I don't know that they had actually solved that problem yet. So I don't know. I'm a bit torn on that question. I mean, I think, yes, I think all of the tools on the consumer side are creating more awareness that we have more control over management of our health than maybe we did before, but we need better examples than just counting steps. Right. So I think counting steps can be great for behavior change and encouraging people to be active and get outside. But there's more to solve. There are bigger problems, I think, for us to go after. And so we have to see that hop from counting steps to something a little bit more transformational.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the most value that digital therapeutics, SAMD or non-SAMD have is their ability to integrate with devices that actually apply therapeutics or apply disease management. And so if you are just monitoring your blood pressure, that's great that you have the ability to do that on the phone, but it's not really serving in treatment. And to really make your product impactful, you want to be able to treat. You want to be able to lessen the load on the patient. You want to be able to ultimately reduce their medication or improve their performance. And so there's a bit more that digital health will need to do to be able to actually be an active competitor. And if we can actually start applying some more treatment to digital health as opposed to viewing and monitoring, I think its relevance will go up in the community.
Great.
I think the good news is that there is like a foundational layer with all of these devices that it's becoming ubiquitous. So there's a significant data layer that enables us to go find the insight in that data and discover the things that actually change behavior and lead to great health outcomes. If you look in Propeller's case, we had to go launch a device on our own. If Apple's Watch can build an ecosystem around it where people are exploring that data and putting it to work in new ways, that's a great outcome for patients. So there's a foundational layer today that just didn't exist 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah, and that's where those partnerships become really important.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Certainly, Dana, Tyrone, Greg, really appreciate your time. It's great to bring people together from around the country as well, and that's what these virtual events allow. We look forward to being in touch, and take care and be safe and well, everyone. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.